Hello and welcome back to another OPRC. We are ready for part 2 in our history of the New Testament, and today we are looking at composition and organization of the New Testament. Specifically today we're going to look at three things: the original language, the materials that were used, and the typography of the earliest manuscripts. I was also going to include the canonization question, books that made it in, books that didn't, but I'm going to have to save that for its own video. One of the comments that we received out of the last video asked specifically about the lost gospel. So I decided I'm going to cheat a little bit, and part 2 is going to have two parts. We'll have part 2A, which is this video, and part 2B, in which we will deal with the canonization question. So, cheating a little bit, but hopefully you'll forgive me for that, and it'll keep these videos short. So, with that being said, let's just dive right on in. The first thing that we want to look at is answering the question. The second question of our pre-test ask, in what language were the books of the New Testament originally written? And hopefully you know the answer to that. It is Greek, and specifically Koine Greek. So some people have argued that the original Gospels were written in Hebrew, and there is a little patristic evidence for that. Specifically, Irenaeus mentioned a Hebrew copy of Matthew, or Matthew's Gospel in Hebrew. But that being said, even if it did exist, we don't have any manuscript evidence to date that justifies that claim. So all of that manuscript evidence, all of our English translations are based on Greek manuscripts. So the earliest that we have are all Greek. Now, early on in New Testament studies, and when I say early on in New Testament studies, I don't mean early on in Christianity, but I mean as this topic began to be studied, which was prior to a lot of the archaeology and the evidence that we have from archaeology today, they considered Koine Greek to be some type of holy language that was used particularly for scriptures and the Gospels and the epistles. But as more manuscripts were found, not just manuscripts for the New Testament, but also other writings in that period of time, what they found was Koine Greek was the common Greek. It was the Greek of the common man. It's what they wrote their grocery list in. That's what, if you were just writing a letter to your friend, that you use this common Greek. And that's where the term koine comes from. It just means common. So the original New Testament manuscripts were all written in the common language of the day, that being Greek, in common or koine Greek. So let's move on to the construction of the manuscripts. So the earliest manuscripts were made out of papyrus. Papyrus is a plant that grows in the marshlands. They would strip it down, they could unroll it and layer it and press it, and the resin inside of it would act as an adhesive. It would stick together, and then they would dry it and they could write on it, and then they would roll it up as a scroll. Around the 4th century, vellum or parchment began to replace papyrus. This was a much longer lasting, much sturdier material. So a majority of our manuscripts that we have are on vellum as opposed to papyrus. And when you look at some of the papyrus that we have, a lot of them are broken or degraded. They don't have edges, or they have holes in them. So the vellum on parchment, that it was just a lot longer lasting material. Another major change that took place during the first 400 years of the church was the way in which these manuscripts were compiled. During the time of Christ, these letters would have been written and rolled up as scrolls. The Old Testament is kept on scrolls. If you go to synagogues, you can still see the Old Testament in scroll form. But the early church was the first to adopt this new technology called a codex. A codex is basically what we have in book form today. It had a binding, it had pages, and you would read the front and the back of those pages. This was a codex, and the church was really ahead of this technology, and that's what we still use today, unless you are using a Kindle or an e-reader or something like that, in which case you have reverted back to scrolling. By the way, I owe a lot of credit to Dr. Dan Wallace for some of this information, as well as the bad scrolling jokes. So, sorry. Anyway, codex binding, along with vellum material, made for a lot better preservation because it now had binding on the front and back, which the scrolls would tend to lose those parts. So it was just better preserved and longer lasting manuscripts. Some of the best preserved ancient manuscripts that we have today are vellum codices. Great examples of those are the Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. So that leads us into typography, because we can look at these two and see an example of what is called the majuscule script. The majuscule manuscripts, without getting too deep into this subject, which you probably don't really care anything about, but they're basically written in capital Greek letters. There's little to no punctuation and no spacing. Over time, this style of writing actually changed, and they changed from majuscule, the capital letters, to minuscules, which is basically, keeping it simple, lowercase cursive style typography. This made it much faster for the scribes to copy. Faster meant cheaper. These things were very, very expensive because they all had to be handwritten, hand copied. So very, very difficult, very, very expensive. So being able to produce them faster meant you could get more in the hands of the church. So later manuscripts, what you start to find is it changes from capital letters to these lowercase letters. In both of these, whether it's majuscule or minuscule, neither one of them use spacing. They didn't space between words, they didn't space between sentences, and you can forget verse demarcations. Those didn't even make it into Scripture until the 1500s. If you think it's hard to follow along with the preacher now or find out where he's preaching from, imagine looking through your Scriptures with no verses, no spacing between sentences, and no spacing between the words. Now, think about those poor scribes hand copying these things. Most of the time, and especially in the early church, these were not professional scribes. This would be a traveler that comes into a new city, and they have a copy of a letter that Paul had written them. And he goes, "Ooh, I want a copy to take back to my hometown, back to my home church." So before he leaves, he sits down with that letter and he hand writes it out with no spacing. Could you imagine how tedious that would be? No backspace, no whiteout, no spare materials to start over when you messed up. Very tedious, very labor intensive, and potentially fraught with mistakes. It's amazing the accuracy level that we have in our manuscripts, but that's a conversation for another day. So that's where we want to stop on this video. We want to pick up next time with part 2B, where we will look at determining the canon of Scripture. We're going to look at, we touched on already why some books were accepted. Now we're going to look at why other books were not. And we're going to answer the question of, was it the Council of Nicaea that determined which books would be in and which books would be out? So if you want to know the answer to that, stick with us. Join us next time. Make sure you hit subscribe with the bell. That way you're notified when that video drops and you can satisfy your curiosity. Thanks for being with us. Drop us a line, drop us a comment, give us a thumbs up if you like it. God bless. Have a great day.